In this scenario, the individual is not just venting about their frustration with their husband, but is also seeking constructive feedback and looking to improve themselves. They're even thinking about how they can communicate differently. This reflective approach fosters a deeper conversation, encouraging both parties to engage in meaningful dialogue. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, we're going to continue to explore the characteristics of borderline personality disorder, a condition that shares several similarities with narcissistic personality disorder. As mentioned in episode 52, over the next few months, I'll be sharing content that helps differentiate BPD from NPD. My goal is to deepen your understanding of narcissism and personality disorders as a whole. Understanding the nuances between these two disorders is essential for anyone working in mental health or simply seeking a deeper understanding of these complex conditions. Perhaps you or someone you know is struggling with the challenges of living with one of these conditions. Why does differentiating between BPD, that's borderline personality disorder, and narcissism matter? Understanding the differences between these two disorders is crucial because they each require unique approaches to treatment and support. And, by the way, when I say support, I don't just mean supporting a loved one, but supporting yourself as well if you struggle with any of the characteristics that I'm about to describe in just a moment. Misunderstanding or misdiagnosing these conditions can lead to ineffective interventions or hinder the healing process for those affected. Before diving into the complexities of misunderstanding or misdiagnosis, let's briefly review some of the defining characteristics of BPD. Individuals with BPD, again, that's borderline personality disorder, often grapple with intense emotional fluctuations, and unstable self-image, and volatile relationships, all of which are rooted in a profound fear of abandonment. This fear goes beyond mere anticipation. They frequently feel rejected or abandoned, and due to underlying ego vulnerabilities, they struggle to regulate the overwhelming anxiety that follows. These difficulties can lead to rapid shifts in emotions, intense episodes of rage, and a pervasive sense of emptiness and neediness, which is typically openly experienced. This is in contrast to the more concealed insecurities around self-esteem typically seen in NPD. I'm not sure I made this point clear in the prior episode on BPD, so I want to emphasize that oftentimes many of the difficulties around emotional dysregulation stem from this fear or this feeling of abandonment. This fear of abandonment is not just a vague worry. It becomes an overwhelming conviction that they will be abandoned. Everyday interactions are often interpreted as confirmation of rejection. Let me give an example of this. If a colleague at work doesn't return their enthusiasm with a friendly greeting, for instance, it may feel like proof that the person dislikes them. This thought can quickly spiral into, I quote, "I hate them." And then that can turn into, "they hate me." And this further destabilizes their emotional state. How do we understand and then approach these overwhelming fears? Why does the present moment, living in the present moment, matter? Focusing on the present moment, identifying triggers for feelings of abandonment, and practicing real-time emotional regulation has been shown by empirical and clinical research to be more effective than revisiting past experiences and like old fights, for example, with a loved one. In that prior episode that I mentioned before on BPD, I shared an example of a woman who had a conflict with her boyfriend. It wasn't until we slowed down and closely examined the details of the fight that we uncovered her feelings of abandonment and rejection. In other words, abandonment isn't always immediately noticeable. You may now be asking, how can an overwhelming conviction that they were or will be abandoned impact emotional regulation? In my field, the field of psychoanalysis, we refer to this as, and I quote, the literal mode of communication. Individuals with personality disorders, particularly BPD, often engage in what can be described as, and I quote again, the literal mode of interaction. I see this frequently in my practice. Patients often share their experiences, and their approach to communication can feel, as they're describing this, like a ventilative process where painful thoughts and feelings are dumped or purged. Stories are often shared not to seek deeper insight, expand self-awareness, or foster closer relationships, but to convey immediate emotional pain and perhaps solicit validation that someone has hurt them. They just want you to agree with their experience and their feeling that someone is evil or treated them poorly. This pattern often stems from early environments that were invalidating, contributing to significant difficulty in regulating their emotional experiences. Words and stories are treated as raw emotional experiences. In other words, they're expressions of distress rather than opportunities for reflection or understanding. As a result, these individuals typically struggle to achieve or maintain a reflective stance on their experiences, making it challenging to step back and analyze the material in a broader or symbolic context. This literal and emotionally charged communication can feel quite overwhelming for everyone involved, often intensifying the tension and making it difficult to navigate the situation constructively. Imagine someone telling a friend, here, I'll just make believe, I'm quoting this, right? Here we go. I can't believe how terrible my day was. Everyone at work hates me, and nothing ever goes right. End of quote. I think you're getting the sense, but just in case, the point that I'm trying to make is that the intention behind this statement isn't necessarily to seek advice or to reflect on what happened to them at work, but simply to express raw emotional pain and maybe hear something like this: no, that's not true. Everyone loves you. Or maybe they want to hear, yeah, the way they treated you was so cruel. That's the validation. Well, actually, that's not even validation. That's just agreeing with their subjective experience. And I mentioned this in prior episodes. That's the kind of stuff that doesn't really lead anywhere. It actually leads to a feeling in both participants of feeling stuck. So the goal, because the goal of the story, like the words in this story, like what I just said, the words are a direct reflection of their feelings in the moment, an attempt to release frustration, perhaps, or seek validation, rather than a genuine inquiry into what happened at work or a deeper understanding of the situation. This kind of communication, often seen in people with BPD, is more about purging, dumping emotions, just getting them out of you, right? It's more about that than inviting thoughtful dialogue, input, or self-reflection. So, what happens with this kind of communication? For the person who's listening, when the person listening, misinterprets this as a request for advice or some kind of feedback, and then they respond with a suggestion, perhaps, it can feel dismissive to the person who's just there to vent, as though their emotions aren't being fully acknowledged. This may lead the person to feel misunderstood or invalidated, increasing their frustration, distress, and rage. So, in other words, the situation escalates when you perhaps, just tries to give them some advice or a suggestion, something that you think is going to be helpful. But it's really important to understand that that's not what they're looking for. They're just looking, again, I know I said this, but I'm driving home this point, just to get something off of their chest. And then when you give them this feedback, what happens? It escalates the situation. They may then shut down. They can intensify their emotions, or they feel even more isolated in their experience and they can begin to withdraw. I'll speak more about what you can do to prevent this in a moment. Now you may be asking, how do individuals without BPD or a personality disorder communicate, if not through the literal mode of interaction? And how does this foster self-reflection and a deeper connection with a loved one? In contrast, those without a borderline personality disorder or a personality disorder tend to engage in what we might call the representational mode of interaction. This is a more symbolic and reflective process where the narrative serves as a tool for deepening meaning. In this mode, the story becomes a collaborative effort between loved ones. The goal is to develop insight and understanding. Unlike the literal mode, this approach allows for reflection, considering the other's contribution, and using the discussion to further regulate one's emotional experience. It facilitates a sense of connection and growth, as the narrative is not just an outlet for emotional pain, but a pathway to greater self-awareness and emotional stability. So again, let's imagine someone sharing something with a friend. And I'm doing that thing again where I quote, okay? I felt really frustrated with my husband today. He puts me on an emotional roller coaster and never hears what I have to say. This made me wonder if I need to develop better communication skills. What strategies do you think could help me express my feelings more effectively? Okay, that's the end of the quote right there. So you could see already, I would imagine, that in this scenario, the individual is not just venting about their frustration with their husband, but is also seeking constructive feedback and looking to improve themselves. They're even thinking about how they can communicate differently. This reflective approach fosters a deeper conversation, encouraging both parties to engage in meaningful dialogue. This difference in modes of interaction also highlights a fundamental distinction in how individuals with BPD listen and interpret interactions, whether with a therapist, a loved one, or even with themselves. Their listening is rooted in literal questions, back to the literal mode. Do you love me? Are you there for me? Will you take care of me? Will you control me? Are you judging me? And here's the big one. This is the way they think, by the way. I'm going over what goes through their mind, oftentimes in just everyday conversations. Are you going to leave? Are you going to abandon me? How can you respond more compassionately? You may now be asking. Typically, at this point, and I certainly did this in the prior episode on BPD, I discuss different ways to relate to a loved one in your life who may be suffering from these narcissistic or whatever characteristics that I'm describing. However, recognizing that you yourself may be struggling with the characteristics that I detailed a little bit earlier and in a prior episode, I want to shift the focus. Let's explore a few tools and techniques that may help you better understand your own emotional experiences, regulate intense feelings, and develop healthier patterns of thinking and therefore relating. These practices are designed to support your journey toward greater self-compassion and growth. As I've been trying to demonstrate, the fear of abandonment is often so overwhelming and complicated that it can distort the perception of reality, making you react with intense emotional shifts, right? So, a compassionate response, or perhaps I should say, being more compassionate with yourself, might start with recognizing that the fear of abandonment, while powerful and painful, doesn't always match reality. Having said that, I fully appreciate that there is always a grain of truth. Perhaps your loved one did pull away or act distant. However, this momentary withdrawal does not equate to the overwhelming and complete abandonment you may feel. The intensity of that fear is often shaped by past experiences and emotional wounds, which magnify, or may otherwise, let's say, they magnify what may otherwise just be a nuanced situation, if that makes sense. And if you can recognize this distinction, this is the first step toward responding to yourself with greater compassion and understanding. Perhaps more difficult to see and acknowledge, maybe we can call this the second step, is that you may also abandon your loved one. For instance, withdrawing or rejecting his hugs or physical affection, while justifying it by saying he hasn't taken responsibility for how he's hurt me, is one way that this can happen. In other words, this is one way that you may reject. You may be the one who abandons, not even knowing it, right? Just by rejecting the hug. Realizing that the rejection, criticism, or abandonment you feel doesn't always fully align with the actual situation. Again, that was the first step that I mentioned a moment ago, is a more nuanced and challenging process. In my experience working with individuals like this shift, this recognition takes time and involves analyzing many examples very closely before one can adopt this new perspective. To revisit what I discussed a little bit earlier, this shift that I'm describing right now represents a movement from a literal mode of interaction, such as my partner is cold or my partner is a narcissist. Yes, that's the literal mode, to a representational mode of thinking, such as, was there a different way I could have expressed at that moment that I was not open to a hug? This is about being in a world where you can now appreciate that interactions are complicated and there are multiple perspectives and layers of meaning that can coexist simultaneously. Let me say that differently. The fear of being judged, iced out, or abandoned is real, but it's often magnified by your past experiences and emotional reactions. A compassionate response doesn't mean ignoring your fear, but offering a space where your emotions can exist, be processed, and put into perspective. If you struggle to find or create this space that I'm referring to, working with a therapist specifically trained to treat personality disorders can be helpful in navigating these complex emotions and these patterns. But what does this shift to a representational mode of thinking actually look like in daily life? How can we start moving beyond the immediate emotional response? Here is a simple example. When you feel abandoned or rejected by someone, your automatic thoughts might be, they don't care about me, or I know she's going to leave me, or he's going to pay attention to some other girl because whatever, I'm not good or I'm not available enough. Instead of letting those thoughts spiral, try to step back and say, okay, I know I'm feeling scared right now, and that's okay. It's tough. And it makes sense that I feel this way given everything that I've been through. And when I say everything, by the way, I mean really considering everything you've been through, not just in this relationship, but in life. Thinking about prior abandonments or rejections, people who have left you in a way when you weren't ready or weren't prepared to handle it. And then that gets followed up with, but this doesn't mean that the worst thing will happen. I'm safe right now. He's still not packing up. He's not packing up right now. And I don't see any other women here that he's paying attention to. I don't see that he's replacing me right now. So that's what I meant earlier about being in the present moment. This is about acknowledging that your emotional pain is real, but that doesn't mean your fears are necessarily true. I recognize there's still so much more to say on this topic, but we have to begin to wrap things up. So, what are a few of the key takeaway points from this episode? 1. When in a dysregulated state, individuals with BPD often communicate in a literal mode, expressing raw emotions to purge and dump distress and seek validation, perhaps, or to escalate the conflict. This contrasts with the representational mode, where communication fosters self-reflection, deeper connections, and emotional regulation. 2. The pervasive fear of abandonment in individuals with BPD can distort their perception of reality, leading to heightened emotional responses. Everyday interactions may be misinterpreted as confirmation of rejection, which intensifies anxiety and triggers impulsive behaviors aimed at immediate relief. 3. I hope I was able to illustrate through all the examples how moving from a literal to a representational mode of interaction involves recognizing and processing emotions without letting them spiral into automatic assumptions. I know you hate me, or he's going to leave, or why should I ever be close to anyone? Everybody leaves me anyway. Those are automatic assumptions. This shift allows for a more nuanced understanding of relationships and interactions, reducing impulsive reactions and fostering healthier communication patterns. Okay, as always, I encourage you to reach out with any questions or comments regarding anything that I covered today. If you want to learn more about narcissistic characteristics, please subscribe to this podcast. If you want to do an even deeper dive into all issues related to personality disorders, I recently released a continuing education seminar series, which can be accessed through my website, which is linked below. Okay, until next time, engage your mind and your symbolic, your representational way of thinking. All right, bye for now. disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.